Hi, it's John Kachik here, and today we're going to be working on a demonstration of a technique called wash-off drawing, or wash-off drawing technique. And the point of this, it's a black and white or monochromatic art form. And the idea is to mimic that of a woodcut print or a linoleum block print. And what we'll be doing is using really inexpensive white poster paint, tempera paint, to act as a lifting agent once we put permanent ink on top. And you'll see and explain that hopefully when we get into this. What we will need for this project is just a variety of watercolor brushes, from something really fine and maybe like a 2 round with a point so you can really get in with some details. You'll need a brush that's going to eventually put ink on the surface completely. You'll need a pencil to do your original drawing, any kind you want. I like a mechanical pencil. If you choose to, some watercolor, any color, just to tint the white poster paint. I call it poster paint, but it's also tempera paint. In this case, they call it washable paint. So we want really inexpensive white paint. It should be very chalky, and if it costs more than $2 for this much, you're getting the wrong stuff. Nothing with acrylic written on it, because if it says acrylic, it's not going to work. It will not lift. The other thing we'll need is permanent ink. It doesn't have to be black. You can use sepia. You can use any color you want, as long as it's darker, of course, than the paper you're working on. You'll need either watercolor paper or illustration board. This is just a piece of illustration board. This is what we're working on today. And illustration board is drawing paper. In this case, it's a cold press, laminated onto thick cardboard. It helps with the rigidity, so when we get it wet in the end, and you'll see what I'm talking about, it will hold up. The other thing, some tray to work your paint on, just water and tape, which will be optional in the end, and you'll see how we use that as well. So let's look at the technique on making the image. All right, so the first thing we need to do with this technique is to consider your drawing. You need to sort of design your image so that it's somewhat it's going to be monochromatic, but that you design the blacks and the white, or the dark tones and the light tones. You can of course get gray tones by putting white hits next to black hits, just the way you would in scratchboard as you're removing the surface, or the way you would in just a pen and ink drawing. But you do need to design where the areas are going to be black and where they're going to be white. This is a photocopy of the drawing that I'm going to show you in a second, which is done on the illustration board. And this shows you, it's a little bit confusing because I'm going to show you how to use just the white paint, or if you want to tint it to see how it works. So this is the drawing as it appeared on the board, but a photocopy version. We'll move that, and this is what now might be a bit confusing, because in parts of this, I've added the watercolor, I'll show you that in a second, to these bits, and they become very gray. And that gray is just so I can see where I'm putting the paint. So if you go back to the sample, you can see on the neck, this pencil almost goes away. But when I was working with the tinted ink, you could clearly see where it was. So let's shake some of this, mix up some of this crummy paint that I'm going to use. So we're going to put that in our little palette. Now, if you're going to work with the white paint, you need a light on such an angle so that you can see the difference. I don't know if the camera's picking this up, but there's a slight difference between here and here. This is the sort of untouched board, and this is the paint. We want to apply the paint as if we're using a woodcut tool on a wood block. So in this case, I decided all the tone in the background is going to go vertically. It's going to go up and down. The piece that has done before the same image, it's a bit smaller, but you'll see that in the final, the brush strokes are all coming in this way. Almost like as if they were dug out with a wood tool. So I'm going to do some of that plain white, and I'm going to show you a tint with the watercolor so you can see the difference. So here, we're just applying the brushed on paint. You can add water if you need it to flow better, but the thicker the paint, the easier it is it's going to wash off. You don't want it so consistent that it looks mechanical. You want it to be somewhat natural. I'm going to do some of these strokes. Now, what you're looking at, this probably represents about 3 hours of work to this point. We're going to do some more of the white, and I'll show you some of the fine work. And then we're going to do some with it tinted, just for those people who have a hard time seeing the white on white. And it isn't easy, but let's give it a go. So this is just the white paint. I'm not even sure if the camera is picking that up. I hope so. Now, the other option is to take a little bit of any color watercolor you want. Now this is going to tint the paint. It shouldn't tint the final work. The ink itself will do that. What's nice about the finished piece is that the ink that you put on top will stain the paper. So you really need to consider your boundaries when you're doing these pieces. You might want to tape the edge to have a really clean area, or you might want to do something that's more natural. I've chosen to have this natural area sort of blocked in where my lines go and where my overcuts would be, that you'll see here. So let's show you a little tint of this. If we take just a little bit of the watercolor, you might need some water. You don't want to get it too thin because then it won't hold up. So this is the way we tint the poster paint or the tempera paint, or whatever we're calling it. Now I can see much more clearly what I'm adding, and it's probably going to help you guys to see with the camera. So most of this background here is done, and I actually even have little pencil marks kind of cheating to where I want it to still be visible at the end. And you can go over, if you have an area that you really want to wash off clean as you can make it, you can go over it more than one coat. So far I'm doing all this background. I'll do some of the fine work too. This is why you want a good brush. I don't know if you guys can see this. It's a really good round with a good point. I'll do some of most of the head of the giraffe has been finished, but you see if I get a really good fine point I can get in these areas where I want a little bit more halftone or black and white sort of gray tones to be created by the white and the black mixed together. So once we get all of this white that we want to be white covered, and we'll do just a little bit more, we'll want that to dry thoroughly. It has to be completely dry before we apply the permanent ink. And again, it doesn't have to be black. We're going to use black today because I think it's going to show up best on the camera, but you could use sepia, you could use a brown, or you could do a mix of brown and sepia, or black and sepia. That's a nice combination too. Gives you kind of a nostalgic look, kind of a weathered, antiqued feel. I hope the camera can, I'm doing the white on white here just because that's what I'm used to. And again, let me try some with the tinted so you can see. I'll go around this guy's lip. So this part, it's a bit, this is the real work part of it. In the end, what we get to look forward to is like absolutely magical. I've taught this technique in probably 10 different classes since I've been teaching here and at Maryland Institute College of Art. And every time the students are just find it to be the most fun project they've been part of. But it's also good for professional work. Like I've used, as an illustrator, I've used this technique with designers to create art for logos. In fact, let me quickly show you this. This piece was a piece that was created for a use of a logo. I think it was for a summer bar party somewhere. I don't remember the client, but we scan it and adjust the contrast to make it cleaner or rougher, whatever you want to do. But this is, you can use this for professional use if you're a designer or an illustrator, or of course just to make fun art. It's just the most fun you can have with monochromatic art, I think. So, and we'll see that at the end. I hope it comes out. So I'll do a little bit more of this tinted. If you're not sure whether you've got it covered, if you got it lined up with a light and put it on an angle, it'll help you to see what is covered and what's not covered, because the paint is very flat, very chalky, and the light will show that the illustration board will appear slightly shinier than the paint itself. So I have just a little bit more to do, and then I use a paper always when I'm working. Everybody has oils, natural oils in your hands, and if you put your hand right on whatever art you're working on, you're going to get oil. You're going to maybe make it so it stains the surface or doesn't lift right, or in case of watercolor, it won't accept the paint right. So always rest your hand on something so that you don't create a primitive oil painting while you're trying to do, in this case, a wash off drawing. So almost done with this. If I want it to be really clean, I'll go over areas I've done. I'll get some more of the tinted so you can see it go on. It doesn't matter if you tint it or not, and you can see here, it doesn't matter if you mix the tinted bits with the clean white paint. It should all come off the same. You want the surface to be stained when it's finished. That's what gives it that nice nostalgic look. So I think this guy's ready to go. So we'll need to just let this dry. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going over areas that I want to be really clean. The little highlight in his eye, which I don't think you can see at this point, but all the little bits in his ear, edges next to it. All right, so at this point we'll let this dry completely, and it won't take long because it is crummy water-based paint. And then the next step I'll show you is how we sort of gently apply ink over the whole piece. We're going to put a permanent ink on top, so all this is completely dry. And at this point, I think I said it before, you really need to consider your edges, where you want your black to stop. If you wanted a clean edge, you could use tape, and you could create a tape edge, and then that's where your black could stop. Or in this case, and I'll show you the one that was done before, I have a little bit of a run over and with these little edges left. And that's what I'm going to do, very similar to this feeling that gives it more of a rustic vintage feel. So then this is the point we want to just lay the paint on and not scrub it. You don't want to scrub the paint in because you don't want to lift the white now. You want to apply this sort of gingerly on top. Make sure your permanent ink is well mixed. And so I'm going to just dip in, and I'm just going to real lightly apply this. I don't want to push, I don't want to scrub too hard with the brush, because then I'll start to activate or soften that white paint. Again, you could use any color of permanent ink you want, but it's got to be waterproof. This is the Higgins Black Magic Waterproof. It usually works pretty well, so we'll keep our fingers crossed on this one. So we'll completely cover this, and again, you see, I'm not spreading the paint or the ink too far because I don't want to scrub into the white. But I am sort of considering. So you can see where we leave all these pencil lines, what we had here. The pencil lines that I covered with the paint. It's okay that the pencil line's there because you can see here, this is where the pencil line was. It is now completely covered by the ink. And because the paint is cheap and because we didn't apply it with the brush so carefully, there should be sort of mistakes, areas that are uncoated that will give us that more natural feel. That's why I like more of a natural edge for me. You guys can do what you want as far as the finished edge. Again, use it pretty liberally because you want the ink to really sit in that surface of the illustration board. This works really well with the watercolor paper too. In fact, this draft, this is just like a 140-pound watercolor paper. And other than when it gets wet, it might wrinkle a bit. It dries flat. And we'll show you that at the end. We'll actually dry this on some napkins or paper towels. All right, so that's about it. So now we need to let this dry. And then next thing we'll do is take it to the sink and see if it works. Just because we're going to use this illustration board, which again is this drawing paper that's been glued to cardboard, I'm just going to put some tape on the edge just to protect it. So when this whole piece gets wet, it won't start to delaminate and we start losing our drawing paper. So I'm just going to quickly cover this. It doesn't have to be perfect because we're going to pull it off right after. And this also isn't creating an edge for our art. It's just, this is just a protective process. Okay, so this is where the magic hopefully happens. This is why we call this the wash-off drawing technique. We have our finished, the white paint applied, permanent ink on top, edges taped because we're going to get it wet. We need just a soft brush. It could be even rougher than this, something just to help it along as the water hits it. So here we go. I'm going to use a little bit of warm water just because it feels better on your hands when you're working than cold. So let's get it wet. So here I'm just gently scrubbing to sort of help it along. The ink can make a mess if you don't wash it as you go. You can see how that's working. You kind of don't want to stay in one area too long because then you don't want to scrub it too much of it off. Again, we don't know what we're going to get until we're done. There might be more or less of the ink. Like for instance, this area, I probably let it get a little blacker than I thought I was gonna. We'll see how it looks. Now you can see why I taped the edges. These edges are getting pretty wet. Some of the paint will lift, some of the paint that you use, the white, will lift better than other brands. It's always an experiment. You never know what you're going to get, so hopefully you get something nice. We like that sort of accidents. It's the places that didn't get as clean as you thought maybe they would get. You can see it's still coming off. Once you get to where it starts to get a little bit gray in this area, you can see that that's when you're really starting to scrub into the permanent ink. But try to get as much of the white off as you can. See here where I went over it quite a few times with the white, it's really, really clean. And I sort of made sure I did that so it would give good definition to the outside edge of the animal. Right, so this is the piece. This is what we worked on. This is why we call it the wash off. The white lifts. You get this real random sort of incidental stuff. Like I was sure I covered more of this with white, but I kind of like that. It adds a little bit to that feeling of the random sort of nostalgic look that I was looking for. So now you'd want to just let it lay on the paper and on paper towels, let it dry completely. You can, if you want, if you have areas that you want to touch up, go back with that permanent paint, and it's easier to add dark than take away. So add if you need to with little brush strokes. You can add color at this point if you wanted with watercolor, pastel, chalk pastels. You could add acrylic, even oil, you know, if you let it dry and you prepare it correctly. Of course, you could just use like this. Great for greeting cards if you wanted to scan it, have them printed. Any use, logos. It's just a fun process. Works really well. It's just fun to do. So, hope you enjoy it. Hope you try it.